We're all eagerly anticipating Bralen Trice's NFL debut later this week in the preseason opener. Let's break down exactly what to expect from him, as well as other key rookies.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more as we get deeper in the summer. FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a booster bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. So if you don't know me, I'm your very humble hater, Aaron Freeman. Been covering the Falcons for a lifetime, formerly at FalcFans.com, RIP. You may also know me as Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, a.k.a. the iron that sharpens the iron, a.k.a. the Jolly Green Giant, a.k.a. Mr. a.k.a. And I thank each and every one of you that go strong with me each and every day, making this illustrious podcast your first listen each and every day. And we call those folks everydayers. And if you want to become an everydayer, all you got to do is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today's episode, we're going to talk a lot about this draft class. Over the weekend, I reached out to my Locked On Falcons insiders and basically asked them, who besides Michael Penix are you eagerly anticipating in this upcoming week's Friday night's preseason opener against the Miami Dolphins? And overwhelmingly, everybody was interested in those top three rookies after the Michael Penix picks: Ruke Orhorhoro, Bralen Trice, and Brandon Dorlus, with Bralen Trice being the front runner based off of that very informal poll from my Locked On Falcons insiders. We will definitely talk a lot about Michael Penix later in the week, probably Thursday night episode, the Friday show, as we gear up for that and talk about his expectations going into that preseason opener. But today we're going to talk all about Trice, Ruke, Dorlus, and a little Casey Washington, maybe even some Nathan Rourke, Taylor Heinicke stuff. So that's all in store for you on today's episode. But let's start off with Bralen Trice, who so far through, basically a week and a half of training camp is getting more and more reps with the ones, looking like he's going to have a similar designated or pass rusher or DPR role like Arnold Ebiketie did last year, alongside Arnold Ebiketie this year, right? And, I know there was a lot of sky high expectations for Arnold Ebiketie going into the season. Like, oh, he's going to get all of Bud Dupree snaps and he's going to blossom based off of what he did last year on a limited snap count. Imagine what he could do with, 3 times as many snaps or whatever the math was for Arnold Ebiketie this year. But it does seem like the Falcons, at least so far, are going to have AK along with Bralen Trice in that DPR role, right, where we're going to have Lorenzo Carter and potentially James Smith-Williams be kind of the starting outside linebackers in that base defense, just because they're going to bring a little bit more impact in the run game on those early downs. We've talked before last year with Ryan Nielsen and playing with softer boxes and all those things, and you want a little bit more size if you're going to play with these 6-man boxes, as teams with all their 3 wide receiver sets and more in today's NFL are basically forcing teams to do. And so that's why I think we'll probably continue to see quite a bit of Lorenzo Carter and James Smith-Williams as those early down guys. But on those obvious passing situations, that's when those DPRs, Arnold Ebiketie, Bralen Trice, can come into the lineup. And we know that teams play nickel in the NFL on average 75% of the time. The Falcons basically played not base defense last year. Looking at the numbers, 82% of the time last year. The Rams were something closer to 70%. So somewhere in that range is probably what you will do, what you will see. And, does that lead to guys like AK, Arnold Ebiketie, and Bralen Trice getting, 70% of the snaps because they're out there on all of those nickel situations? Or are they sort of splitting reps with Lorenzo Carter, James Smith-Williams in those situations, so their snap count looks more closer to what a standard DPR is, which is 35-40% of the snaps, as opposed to 60-70% or more? So we'll see on that end. But, talking about Bralen Trice, like I know there's this narrative that, my guy Jarvis Davis is out here pushing that Aaron hates Bralen Trice. I don't hate Bralen Trice. I just, I don't see him as the savior for this pass rush. But I think the one thing that Bralen Trice does bring to the table that, there's no doubt about that, it pops off of his film watching him at Washington, is the effort, the toughness that he's going to bring to the table. The question I have is just, is that going to translate with the athleticism, the bend, the technique and stuff to be that sort of impactful pass rusher right away and be that guy that can be the productive player that, everybody wants him to be? Is he just a pressure guy? That's what he was in college. He got a ton of pressures in college, right? More pressures than anybody else in college football the last 2 years. But relatively speaking, based off how many pressures he's got, right, he should have theoretically, if based off of what we typically see in the college level, got twice as many sacks as he got based off of the pressures. Instead of having 17 sacks the last 2 years, he should have something 30 plus sacks based off of the 150 pressures that he had in that period of time. We talked about it when we broke him down last month in June, right? He had one of the lower sack conversion rates based off of how many pressures he had among all edge rushers over the last 2 years, like bottom 4 out of all, like the 50 or however many edge rushers have been drafted over the last couple of years. And that's part of the reason why, like, I'm not hyping him up as this sort of savior that's going to come in and be the salvation for this Falcons pass rush. But even if he isn't the savior, absolutely, we can believe that Bralen Trice is going to be a step in the right direction. Adding anything to this Falcons pass rush, as I often say, beggars can't be choosers, guys. Adding anything to this group is going to benefit this group. It's just a question of how big that benefit is going to be. And so we'll see what Bralen Trice, right? He should get plenty of opportunities this year as that sort of designated pass rusher role. The question is, will he get 300 snaps? Will he get 700 snaps, or somewhere in between that number? We saw Arnold Ebiketie play 500 snaps as a rookie, roughly. Ade Ogundeji played roughly 500 snaps as a rookie. Now, those guys, AK had 28 pressures as a rookie. Ade Ogundeji had 11 pressures as a rookie. Will we see Trice get somewhere in that range, 20, 25, 30 or more pressures? You compare that to, say, a Takk McKinley or a Vic Beasley. Takk McKinley as a rookie played 460 snaps, had 39 pressures. Vic Beasley as a rookie, 530 snaps, 42 pressures. Will we see Bralen Trice be able to top those guys, or will we see something closer to what we saw from Arnold Ebiketie, something we saw closer to Ade Ogundeji? Now, my personal expectations is probably something closer to what AK's level of production, probably 25, 30 some odd pressures this year for Bralen Trice. But again, we'll have to sort of see on that. And I think a lot of that is going to depend on how he looks in these upcoming preseason action, right? That's going to be a key part of going back and watching the film. For me, on Saturday morning, is keying on Bralen Trice as well as several of these other rookies. We saw Arnold Ebiketie in that first preseason action against the Dolphins, going up against their backup offensive line. We knew the Dolphins' first-string offensive line was questionable, so certainly their backup offensive line was very questionable. Arnold Ebiketie dominated that game, right? And then we saw D'Angelo Malone dominate the next week against Cincinnati. But, will we see Bralen Trice come out of the gate and dominate this game? Right? Will we see Arnold Ebiketie dominate? Because I'm expecting him to play on Friday night as well. So those are all going to be questions that we're going to have. I can understand why lots of folks are excited to see what Bralen Trice, given some of the building buzz that we've gotten since the start of training camp, where he's getting more of those reps with the ones in the nickel, in obvious passing situations. Will he be unleashed this season? That's going to be a big question. But I think Friday night is going to be, sort of our first data point to sort of see what Bralen Trice can bring to the table. And I'm eagerly anticipating to see if it's just effort, if it's just toughness that he's bringing, or is there going to be a little bit more technical know-how, a little bit more, impact as a pass rusher that we're going to see from him this upcoming season. Again, I think being a high effort, being a tough guy is going to be an asset for this team moving forward in their pass rush. Again, is that the savior? I don't know. But I think for both him, Arnold Ebiketie, they're going to get a lot of opportunities this upcoming season. And then the question is just going to be, what do Hay and Ebiketie do to make the most of those opportunities, to the point where are we going to still be talking about the Falcons getting that big time edge rusher heading into next offseason, as a need that we've been talking about for the last 2 years? Or are we going to be like, hey, this is not as big a need as we thought, because Bralen Trice and Arnold Ebiketie were able to make those big leaps that some people think they're expected to make this upcoming season? So that will be a question. Are we going to be having a Micah Parsons conversation? Basically, is we'll see on that front. 9 months from now or 6 months from now. So we'll see on that. But I'm eagerly anticipating what Bralen Trice is going to be. But he's not the only rookie that I'm going to have my eye on. I know many of you have your eye on those rookies along the defensive line, looking mainly at Ruke Orhorhoro, looking mainly at Bralen Dorlus. Sorry, Zion Logue, but I got my eye on you, Zion Logue. But I know the Locked On Falcons insiders are more keyed on Ruke Orhorhoro and Bralen Dorlus, and we'll talk about why our Locked On Falcons insiders are keyed on them and what do those two guys do. We know they're going to be a part of the rotation to keep guys like Grady, Jarrett, and David Onyemata fresh this year. But when will we see those guys impact on the field? Will we see them impact in that sort of rotational role or not? And we'll break that down to continue today's Locked On Falcons. Guys, this show is sponsored by BetterHelp. And, you got to ask the question, what are your self-care non-negotiables, right? Do you skip leg day or, is it about therapy, right? Therapy day. And, when your schedule is packed with kids' activities, big work projects, and so much more, it's easy to let our priorities slip. It's hard to make time for things, even when we know these things make us happy. But when you feel like you have no time for yourself, non-negotiables like therapy are more important than ever. Therapy has taught me positive coping skills, like you can only control what you can control. And I use that every single Sunday when I watch the Atlanta Falcons play. And if you're thinking of starting therapy to get these positive coping skills or whatever you need help with, you should give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online. It's designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire. You'll get matched with a licensed therapist, and you can switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Never skip therapy day with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/lockedon to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. So, guys, I'm currently dealing with some AC issues. So if my beautiful bald head is glistening a little bit extra today, you understand why. But, trying to stay cool in the summer. Things are heating up for these Falcons rookies. And we know with Ruke Orhorhoro, Bralen Dorlus, we've known from the jump that their primary roles this year are going to be to keep guys like Grady, Jarrett, and David Onyemata fresh, right? We know that this Falcons pass rush, as we've been saying for months now here on this podcast, is anchored by those two guys, those two veteran players. Those are the two proven guys in your pass rush. And the question, whether we're talking about Trice, Ruke, Dorlus, Zach Harrison, and so many others, is what else are you going to get from these young players this upcoming season? Now, keeping Grady, Jarrett, and David Onyemata fresh is important, and you guys should keep your listens fresh, especially as your second listen after you make Locked On Falcons your first listen, because that second listen, why not enjoy the Locked On Fantasy Football podcast? Get daily insight on the best fantasy strategies that are going to help you win your league this year. Locked On Fantasy Football is part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So keeping Grady, Jarrett, David Onyemata fresh, those guys will get plenty of opportunities in the talking about Ruke and Dorlus, keeping those guys fresh, right? And it's just going to be, what do they do given those opportunities, right? Now, I'm expecting those opportunities to mostly come in the base defense, right? Especially for someone like Ruke Orhorhoro. We'll see on Bralen Dorlus, right? We talked about this when we did our breakdown of him. We like Dorlus's long-term pass rush potential, but we didn't think relative to some other players on the Falcons D-line that he was maybe the best run defender, right? He's more that sort of disruptive, penetrating guy, and Oregon didn't really ask him to do that. And will the Falcons ask him to do more of that, or are they going to be more willing guys that are big, physical, that can hold the point of attack? And Ruke Orhorhoro is a little bit better suited for that role. Other guys up front that they have are better suited for that role, like Taquan Graham, like Zach Harrison, big, physical, powerful guys that are much better suited to kind of controlling the line of scrimmage with their long arms and whatnot. Not to say Dorlus is weak in that area, but just not as good as those other guys. So if the goal is to, stack the D-line with as many of those guys as possible, that may leave Dorlus a little bit by the wayside. And so that's one of the reasons why we were questioning going into training camp, would Bralen Dorlus be buried on the depth chart? And so far, the early going seems to suggest that is somewhat true compared to guys like Ruke and others, that he does seem like he's getting less work with the ones and twos, at least early on. We'll see if that builds or changes over the next couple of weeks as we get through these games, and especially if he can start making plays in some of these preseason games and in the coming week in joint practices, we can have a very different conversation about that, weeks from now. We talked about this the other day with Jarvis Davis, right? Going back to last summer, like Micah Abernathy was getting all the second team reps at safety throughout training camp. And then we got to the preseason games and DeMarco Hellams starts making plays. And by the end of training camp, DeMarco Hellams starts stealing those second team reps. And so we'll see. That's kind of the process, right? We can't put too much stock in the first 10 days. The next 10 days will play a lot when it comes to how these position battles will play. But, the key question I have for both Ruke and Bralen Dorlus is when they get those opportunities, however they get those opportunities this year, are they going to be guys making plays of their own, right? How ready are they going to be heading into this season to make plays themselves, right? And I think this week's joint practices, these upcoming preseason games are going to help tell us and inform us on that. It's kind of basically asking yourself, it's a Zach Harrison situation, right? We saw with Zach Harrison, right? That when he was out there early in the season for the first 3 months out there, he was playing 15, 25 snaps a game. Wasn't really doing it. He was just there taking up space, right? He was just there keeping Calais Campbell fresh. That was what he was doing instead of really being a guy that was making plays. I'm sure, you guys can't recall a single moment from, I know I can. I watch, every game 3 times. I can't recall a single moment that Zach Harrison had in the first 3 months of the season. But then something flipped in that last month of the season, and we started seeing him make plays in that Carolina game, in that Colts game, and other games as well. I think Chicago as well. I think that was the final game he played last year. And to me, the question with Ruke and Dorlus is kind of like, at what point do we get to that Harrison level where it's just not them out there taking up space? When are they actually out there making plays themselves? Is that something that we have to wait till December? Is that something that we'll get in October, maybe November? Is that something that we won't get at all in 2024 and we will have to wait till the 2025 season? That remains to be seen. But I think for both Dorlus and Ruke Orhorhoro, they have loads of potential. My personal opinion is I'm expecting more of that to manifest in years 2 and 3 as opposed to year 1. But, what exactly are we going to get from those guys in year 1? And that's going to be something that I'm going to be keying on in these preseason games alongside Bralen Trice with Ruke Orhorhoro, Bralen Dorlus. Like, how ready are these guys? Are these guys being disruptive and sort of dominating these second and third string offensive lines in these upcoming preseason games? Or are they just kind of out there just taking up space? Because again, it's not going to be second and third string offensive lines that they're facing in the regular season. It's going to be starters. It's going to be proven starters. And so, dominating the second string guys usually indicates that at least you'll do something against the first team. That doesn't mean you're going to dominate the first string guys. But if you're not dominating the second string guys, it's very unlikely you're going to do something against, starters at the next level. But we'll see on Ruke. We'll see on Dorlus. We'll see on Bralen Trice. We'll also see on Casey Washington, right? He's the offensive weapon that at least the Lockdown Falcons, relatively speaking, are much more interested in. No offense to Jace McClellan. Obviously, everybody loves Michael Penix, but again, we'll talk more about Michael Penix later in the week. That's so obvious, right? We'll get deeper into that. But Casey Washington is an intriguing player because he's slowly starting to make plays or maybe not slowly is not the right word, but he's steadily starting to make plays. That's a better word. Steadily making plays in practice. And, he should be a guy that could get featured a lot in these preseason games working with Michael Penix. And we'll talk about, how that will impact his potential climb up the Falcons depth chart as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. Now, guys, it is the summertime and, NFL season is right around the corner and, sports are starting to start sporting like we want them to, but it's not quite there yet. And FanDuel is going to help you out by hooking up all customers with a daily boost or bonus. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. All you got to do is head on over to FanDuel.com. And whether you're looking forward to the upcoming NFL season, whether you want to get in on this Olympics action, did you put some money down on Noah Lyles and Sha'Carri Richardson's finishes in 100 meters or whatever, you want to get some action on the preseason, the upcoming season, Kirk Cousins, how many tutties he's going to have this year. It's all available over at FanDuel.com, and you can make the most out of your summer. FanDuel is an official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. So wrapping up today's Locked On Falcons, and probably tomorrow's episode, we'll get into more of what these joint practices may indicate for these sort of 5 key position battles that we've been discussing, all summer long: the slot receiver, nose tackle, the weak side linebacker, outside cornerback, and strong safety, and sort of if we'll get some separation over the next couple of days down in Miami. But that will be in store for you tomorrow. So continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen. But today we'll wrap up talking about, the wide receiver position, not quite the slot receiver position, although, Rondale Moore is going to have an interesting week, I think, as he tries to make up ground for Ray-Ray McCloud, but we can get more on that tomorrow. But, I think Moore and Casey Washington are two guys that will have plenty of opportunities this preseason, beginning on Friday night, to really shine and be featured, because they're probably going to get a lot of the work alongside Michael Penix, right? We're expecting Michael Penix to take the majority of snaps from under center over these next 3 weeks in the preseason over other quarterbacks. We're not going to see probably any of Kirk Cousins. We might see a little bit of Taylor Heinicke and a little bit of Nathan Rourke, but we'll probably see a lot of Michael Penix. And by all accounts, the two receivers that he seems to have the strongest rapport with in practice are Rondale Moore and Casey Washington, right? Casey Washington has that clear connection with Michael Penix, been working with him since May rookie mini camps. And we talked about Casey Washington, at the beginning of July, talking about what his skill set is, kind of a poor man's Drake London skill set because of the good hands, because of the contested catch ability. We question the route running. We question the ability to beat press question. Those were my two biggest questions. Press coverage, with Casey Washington. But, he's going to be playing probably that Z role, same role that Drake London's going to play. So the press probably is not going to matter all that much. I saw a one-on-one rep where I think it was Natron Brooks was able to kind of jam him at the line of scrimmage. And so that kind of adds fuel to, that's something he's going to have to improve with some of those releases and whatnot. But that Z role in the offense, we're going to see that guy probably go in motion. That's going to be the featured weapon for, Drake London's going to be that featured weapon. We talked about that a ton, where how Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp and Robert Woods, that Z has been the featured weapon in the Sean McVay offense, as opposed to the X wide receiver, which is typically the featured weapon in the Shanahan version of the offense with Brandon Ayuk and Julio Jones and Andre Johnson, Hall of Famer Andre Johnson, we should note. But, we'll see what Casey Washington's do. So, again, I think in these preseason games, it's really setting up for Casey Washington to get a lot of targets in the preseason, and we'll see what he does making the most of those targets. Right now, I'm not expecting Casey Washington to get a ton of reps during the regular season, right? Because I'm just assuming Drake London's going to get all those snaps, but that could change if we see more of Casey Washington not just playing that sort of Z flanker role at the wide receiver position, and see him play more of that X role or that slot role in the preseason, and him getting moved around a little bit more, playing multiple positions. That would open the door for Casey Washington to get more opportunities, because we know who the X is, that's Darnell Mooney. We know who the Z is and Drake London. The question is that slot receiver. And so if Casey Washington's getting some of those slot reps, that may open the door for him to get into the mix alongside Rondale Moore, Ray McCloud for that slot role. But again, in the preseason, Casey Washington should be featured, should have a big preseason. And if he does have a big preseason, does that open the opportunity for him to have a bigger role during the regular season? We'll have to sort of see on that front. So don't have a whole lot else to say on Casey Washington. We'll just sort of have to wait and see sort of what he does, how exactly he's used. But I'm expecting, I'm not going to say it's the summer of Casey Washington, but, it may be somebody that we might see be the featured weapon. Or at least I'm expecting going into these preseason games, he should get a lot of targets alongside Rondale Moore and others for that second unit offense working with Michael Penix. So we'll see on that front. But talking about Michael Penix in the quarterback competition, the Falcons did add a quarterback, last week, in the middle of last week, adding Nathan Rourke. They tried to claim Nathan Rourke off waivers back in May when he was cut by the Patriots. The Giants had waiver priority at that point in time, were able to scoop him up. They cut him at the end of July, and then the Falcons signed him the other day alongside tight end Jordan Thomas. And I think this move is notable because it has potential ramifications at the quarterback position, right? This is not just a camp body. This is a guy that legitimately, I think, can put Taylor Heinicke on the roster bubble. Now, I know we talked about this at the beginning of the camp. Taylor Heinicke was already on the roster bubble, but you heard me talk, to me, there was not a realistic world where John Paddock was going to make this Falcons roster as the third quarterback over someone like a Taylor Heinicke. I just didn't think that was very realistic, but Rourke does have a realistic shot of pushing Taylor Heinicke off the roster. And the reason why this is important, because, this could lead to a trade later this summer where the Falcons could move Taylor Heinicke for a potential late round pick, right? We've seen some trades in recent years. Nick Mullins got traded to the Vikings a couple of years ago in 2022 to be their backup quarterback. That usually nets a conditional 6th or 7th round pick, depending on the team. If a team is looking for Taylor Heinicke to potentially be a starter for them, maybe that could push it up to a conditional 5th round pick. That's what the Cardinals gave up for Josh Dobbs last year when they wanted him to sort of be their, seat warmer, I guess you could say, before Kyler Murray came back in the season, so QB1. So, if a team is out there being like, hey, we need Taylor Heinicke to start, games for us, they might give us a fifth. If they're just looking for Taylor Heinicke to be a backup for them or whatever, that's probably a conditional 6th or 7th in next year's draft. And of course, the Falcons may be willing to do that because they lost a 5th round pick next year due to the tampering charges. Now, I don't look around the league currently and say there's an obvious candidate. This team wants to trade for Taylor Heinicke. The team that's most likely to trade for Taylor Heinicke is someone that is familiar with him. Unfortunately, Ron Rivera doesn't coach in the league currently. And Ron Rivera has had a very firm attachment to Taylor Heinicke. Ken Zampese, who was Taylor Heinicke's quarterback coach for 3 years in Washington under Ron Rivera, is currently in Atlanta, and that's part of the reason why you've heard me say I don't think Taylor Heinicke is as guaranteed a cut as others seem to think he is, but we'll have to sort of see. 2 other coaches that have some experience with Taylor Heinicke, Scott Turner, his OC in Washington for several years, is now with the Raiders. Dave Ragone, who was his OC last year in Atlanta, is now with the Rams. And to me, looking at these teams, I'm like, the Rams make the most sense if Stetson Bennett doesn't necessarily impress the Rams as Matthew Stafford's primary backup. Could I see the Rams picking up, giving a conditional 7th round pick to pick up Taylor Heinicke this year? Sure. I mean, the Rams brought in guys like Baker Mayfield and Carson Wentz in the middle of seasons and whatnot. So why not Taylor Heinicke? So I'll be curious. We'll keep an eye on this. Obviously, a lot of this depends on how guys perform, how Penix performs, how Rourke performs, how Heinicke performs in the summer. Nothing is sort of guaranteed at this point in time, but this is the first sort of shot across real shot across the bow for Taylor Heinicke, talking about him potentially being moved on at this point in time. So wanted to talk about that because it's a recent roster move, and we'll talk more about Penix and how he can, I guess, grease the wheels for Taylor Heinicke to be moved out the door based off of his performance, in joint practices on Friday in the preseason game. But that will be something that we'll talk about later this week. As I suggested earlier, we'll talk about, some of the key position battles that we'll have our eye on going into the joint practices later this week. And then we'll hopefully have some guests, got a couple people lined up that will be down in Miami for those joint practices, and we'll get their thoughts on those on Tuesday and Wednesday evening when those occur. So lots of great content coming your way here on Locked On Falcons all week long. Getting excited about this rookie class. We'll be talking all about those guys all week long here on the podcast. So continue to make us your first listen. All you got to do so is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. For your second listen, of course, check out the Locked On Fantasy Football podcast, helping you win your league this year. It is August and fantasy football season is right. It's gearing up. Got to get those tips. Check out Locked On Fantasy Football, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every